Welcome back to 60 Minutes. Susan Neill Fraser is tonight behind bars. A mother, a grandmother, convicted of murdering her partner, Bob Chappell. Convicted by a jury of her peers, sentenced to 23 years. But there's one problem. Susan Neill Fraser is innocent. That's the unqualified conclusion by some of the finest legal and police minds in the country, including one of our foremost experts in miscarriages of justice. I first looked at a case a year ago and was convinced there was enough reasonable doubt to acquit her at trial. Now the case to set her free is even stronger, if not undeniable, thanks to the new and compelling forensic evidence. For the past 5 years, Susan Neill Fraser's been languishing in Hobart's Risdon jail, convicted of murdering her partner, Bob Chappell. A charge she's always denied. Back at home, her daughter Sarah Bowles, herself now a mother, is still coming to terms with what happened.
It's like Isaac. And it's always bittersweet, because it's beautiful to see Mum playing with Elizabeth and interacting and having that really special time together, but because it's so short, it's so sad to see, and it makes me so angry, but you can't do anything about it.
Our interview is interrupted.
Oh, it's Mum. Is that Neill?
It's Sarah's mum. The 1 10-minute call per day that she's allowed.
I'm just doing an interview at the moment.
And today, Susan Neill Fraser is struggling.
Well, I feel fairly hopeless at the moment, Sarah. I think that we just have to keep plugging away and try to raise the Attorney General's awareness that there has been a serious miscarriage of justice.
If this was a work of fiction, this would be a great discussion to continue with. But to actually think that we're discussing a trial process in which somebody's being convicted of murder is quite shocking in my view.
In the hundreds of cases that you've looked at, how bad is this one?
This is the worst of the worst.
Tonight, the new forensic evidence that rips apart the police case and shows that Sue Neill Fraser should be set free.
We're seeing the same error that was made in Lindy Chamberlain over 30 years ago.
The blood that was never there.
There's no blood in the dinghy at all.
Not a drop.
I saw a boat out there.
The confused eyewitness.
Would you say it was there or would you say it was there?
I couldn't be sure.
And the possible suspect whom police completely ignored.
And the fact that you have a person at a crime scene, a potential murder scene, when they say they weren't there, changes the whole complexion of the case.
Bob Chappell and Sue Neill Fraser had been partners for 18 years, by most accounts, happily living in Hobart. They'd spent much of Australia Day 2009 on the Derwent River aboard their dream yacht, the Four Winds. Bob decided to stay on board alone overnight, which wasn't unusual. Susan went ashore in their inflatable white dinghy at around 2 that afternoon. By the next morning, the yacht is discovered half submerged and Bob is missing, presumed murdered.
I mean, even at a personal level, Mum must have been going through so much more intense sort of emotions than I was, but even me, Bob missing, presumed dead, being a part of a murder, I mean, that stuff, we've never been involved in anything like this.
Police yesterday charged Susan Neill Fraser with the murder of her partner, Bob Chappell.
7 months after Bob's disappearance, Susan Neill Fraser would be charged with his murder. It is true that she seriously weakened her defence by initially lying to police about her movements that night. And in the court of public opinion, she wasn't seen to play the role of a distraught widow. But as we discovered last year, the prosecution case was big on imagination.
There's no body, there's no murder weapon, there are no injuries to be interpreted, and yet the prosecutor put all those things together and told the jury that this man had been struck on the head and killed with a single blow.
Dr. Bob Moles is Australia's leading expert on miscarriages of justice. Of the hundreds of cases he's reviewed, Bob ranks Susan's among the worst injustices in Australian criminal history. The prosecution case lacking in logic.
According to the prosecutor, she's killed him or laid him out, and now she has to manipulate the body up there.
She's not a strong woman.
But then once it's actually up on the deck there, she's then got to manoeuvre it over the side into the dinghy, which is quite a way down below.
The Four Winds dinghy, supposedly drenched with Bob Chappell's blood, is the first of several pieces of evidence now shown to be dubious.
An independent expert has shown there is no confirmed blood from Bob Chappell in that dinghy.
Barbara Etta is a lawyer and former high-ranking police officer. She was Western Australia's Assistant Police Commissioner. Barbara is bringing her considerable legal and policing experience to the task of freeing Neill Fraser.
The court was shown, I think, a highly prejudicial photo
Yeah.
of the Four Winds dinghy, glowing bright blue, and being told that there was blood, that Bob Chappell's blood was in that dinghy.
But this independent report by Australia's leading expert on bloodstain analysis proves that the blue, luridly glowing substance is in fact not blood. It's a chemical reaction from the testing agent called Luminol.
The Luminol is a presumptive sort of screening test, but the point is that a screening test actually doesn't identify the existence of blood. What it does do is identify a whole range of possible substances that could give a positive result. And these include bleach, paints, metals, vegetables will give a positive result. And sometimes it'll give a positive result just because you've sprayed too much luminol.
Even Sue's daughter Sarah was convinced in court.
I thought, oh my God, there's been a bloodbath in the dinghy. He's been slaughtered.
But you weren't questioning that it was blood.
I wasn't. I went along the lines of thinking, oh, there's blood all through the dinghy because that's what it was made out to be.
The judge made it perfectly clear to the jury in his summing up that we could exclude the fact that Mr. Chappell had disappeared because of the presence of blood that was found in the dinghy and on the yacht.
So that a large part of the state case has vanished.
Absolutely. Fundamentally misinformed, and she's entitled to have her conviction set aside.
This false blood test is just the first of many holes in the prosecution case.
Well, once I rung in and said, look, I think I saw the boat, but I'm not sure.
Peter Lorraine was a star witness for the prosecution. He was walking along the foreshore late that Australia Day afternoon and believes he saw Bob Chappell working on the deck of the Four Winds just before 5 o'clock.
All I can say is I saw a boat out there with an elderly man on it, and the boat looked like the boat that was described as the gentleman's boat, and there wasn't any boat traffic.
In terms of the boats we're looking at now, which one would have been close to where the Four Winds was at the time?
I would say it would be between that motorboat and that sailing boat.
Between the nearest sailing boat and the motorboat?
Yeah.
Peter points directly out in front. Consistent with his statements and evidence in court. But in fact, the Four Winds wasn't moored where Peter thought. It was 45 degrees to the right and 320 metres off the jetty, much further out. To test Peter's account, we placed this white yacht with a black canopy on the Four Winds mooring.
Yeah, I guess all I can say is I saw a boat and I saw a person on it, and it looked like Mr Chappell
Do
from...
you agree, though, there's a big difference there, isn't it? If the Four Winds was actually there and the boat you saw was there, then it's not one and the same boat, is it?
No, but I'm not, as I say, I can't be completely clear. So I couldn't identify Mr Chappell personally. All I could say was there's, an elderly figure on the boat.
That afternoon, at the same time Peter thought he saw Bob alive, several other witnesses saw things very differently.
I'm looking at the boats that were the furthest out, and one in particular caught my eye because...
Jill Aiken was also looking out on the Derwent River and noticed the Four Winds. She saw no sign of Bob, but did notice a dinghy attached to the yacht. Despite the fact that Susan Neill Fraser had gone ashore on their inflatable white dinghy approximately 3 hours earlier.
As the boat swung around slightly, I could see that there was a dinghy tethered to the starboard side, which was an aluminium dinghy.
So not the dinghy that goes with the boat, not an inflatable...
Not an inflatable.
Jill was actually one of 4 witnesses who saw a grey dinghy attached to the side of the Four Winds late that afternoon. They all said that it wasn't Bob and Sue's white inflatable. The mystery is, why didn't the police follow up on this dinghy? Who owned it and what was it doing here? Perhaps it didn't suit their case.
The police did come to see me and I showed the gentleman where it was. And the policeman confirmed that where I was looking was where the Four Winds had been.
Yeah.
The sighting of the grey aluminium dinghy becomes crucially important. If Peter was looking at the wrong boat, who's to say Bob wasn't killed earlier by whoever came aboard from that dinghy?
So the grey dinghy and the people associated with that grey dinghy could well be the murderers and the people who sabotaged the Four Winds.
The 60-year-old mother of 2 is serving a 23-year sentence for the murder of her partner, Bob Chappell. But legal experts are convinced it is one of Australia's most serious miscarriages of justice. Sue Neill Fraser is behind bars, largely because the prosecution successfully argued she was the only possible suspect. We now know that's not true.
The fact of the matter is the case was carefully tailored to fit a particular outcome and a preferred scenario, and it didn't take into account all the other factors and didn't comply with the relevant legal rules about how a trial should be conducted.
In the days after Bob Chappell went missing, mystery DNA was found on the deck of the Four Winds. It would eventually be matched to a then 16-year-old homeless girl, Megan Vass. In court, she denied ever being on the Four Winds, and the prosecution said her DNA must have got on board by what's called secondary transfer.
At the trial, they said it could have been brought in on the boot of some copper or something of that sort by having trodden on it somewhere else.
But that's wrong, according to the highly respected Victoria Police Forensic Services Department, which concludes...
There is no evidence to support the hypothesis that the DNA detected was the result of a secondary transfer event caused through foot traffic on the deck of Four Winds.
It had to be what they call a primary deposit, which means that it must be either blood, bodily fluids or saliva, something of that sort, which was deposited by the person themselves as they got onto the boat. So it means that Megan Vass can now be said to have been on the boat at that point.
Yeah, and even if it didn't say that that girl particularly did it, it does say that the forensic process was flawed.
You don't have to establish that Sue Neill Fraser is innocent. You don't have to establish that Megan Vass is guilty of anything. You just have to show that the case that was put to the jury was incorrect, and that would be in itself sufficient to warrant a retrial.
And Megan Vass wasn't the only homeless person in the vicinity that night who would be dismissed by police.
The court, during Sue Neill Fraser's trial, was led to believe that there was no evidence of homeless people on the foreshore that night, that they had been accounted for, which is not the case. we can prove that that was not the case. The police records indicate that that is not the case.
There were 3 itinerant men on the foreshore that night. One of them stands out, violent criminal Paul Rowe.
Mr. Rowe was referred to as a hitman and a person who had multiple identities.
Paul Rowe has a 9-page criminal history, including time served in New South Wales for malicious wounding. In 2007, he moved to Tasmania, living on this yacht. It was moored just a few hundred metres from the Four Winds on the day Bob Chappell disappeared.
But from a police point of view, you actually have a person who is a past history of violence and criminal activity, and in the vicinity of a purported crime. You'd obviously conduct a careful inquiry at the time, wouldn't you?
It wasn't until 3 years after Bob Chappell's disappearance and more than a year after Sue Neill Fraser's conviction that police finally interviewed Paul Rowe. Shortly afterwards, he sold his yacht and left Tasmania.
It's another example of failing to follow up on key leads because they already had Mum in their sights. They had a theory, they wanted to secure an arrest and a conviction.
You would argue they're looking for a conviction and not necessarily to solve a crime.
Absolutely, because, you know, I even had one of the detectives say this was a career case for him. This was about, you know, people's careers, it's about statistics, it's about getting a result.
What Susan Neill Fraser's supporters think really happened out there in the Four Winds was a break-in gone wrong. Bob was alone on the boat with no dinghy attached. Now that's usually a sign that there's no one there. Break-ins are extremely common around here, and those who know Bob say that if someone had trespassed on his boat, he would have reacted angrily.
There could have been Megan Vass, for example. There could have been homeless people. There could have been people on the grey dinghy. There could have been all sorts of people who may have been involved and cannot be satisfactorily excluded. But we have to exclude them if we're going to have Sue Neill Fraser convicted of murder.
Megan Vass and Paul Rowe might well be innocent, but what's beyond doubt is this: they were not thoroughly investigated because police only had eyes for Susan Neill Fraser.
You know, whatever happened to him, whether he...
For Susan, calling in from prison, the break-in gone wrong theory is the most likely.
From the evidence we now have, the new evidence, I think that it wasn't murder at all. I mean, nobody would harm Bob, and so one has to think of perhaps a burglary, and they wouldn't have even thought Bob was aboard, probably.
How did this happen to us? Bob missing, dead, Mum wrongfully convicted of his murder.
But the cards are still stacked against Susan Neill Fraser. In Tasmania, as with most of Australia, new evidence is not admissible on appeal.
I'd like to share with you one of my fondest memories of Bob and Mum.
For Sarah, this is about more than just her mother's fate. It calls into question the justice system itself.
Thank you all for coming.
It's really shattered my faith in a system that's held up to be, you know, about truth and justice. And unless we're prepared to recognise and address those faults, then they just keep happening to other people.
Hello, I'm Charles Wooley. Thanks for watching. To keep up with the latest from 60 Minutes Australia, make sure you subscribe to our channel. You can also download the 9Now app for full episodes and other exclusive 60 Minutes content.